Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Glauber Costa. Glauber is the co-founder and CEO of Turso Database. Turso Database is a database that is essentially hosted SQLite at the edge, specifically network edges. It's highly distributed SQLite that offers incredible consistency, read-as-you-write consistency, and solves the problem of horizontal scale for relational databases. In our discussion, we talk about the market conditions for the database as a service space, founding Turso, and the big semantic dissonance between the term serverless and edge. Specifically, some people think edge means a runtime that uses V8 isolates, instead of the actual definition of the edge, which is the boundaries between networks. So your network edge is the edge between your internet service provider and the broader internet. In this discussion, we disambiguate some of those terms and highlight the value that Turso adds to a number of startups and enterprises alike. One thing worth mentioning is that Glauber is not Joe Rogan. He asked me to mention that while he looks a lot like Joe Rogan, he is indeed not. Glauber is also the host of the Save File podcast. The Save File is a podcast that explores the intersection of religion or faith and STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. I've been a guest on Glauber's podcast, so has Kent C. Dodds, The Primogen, and others. If you'd like to check that out, there's links to that in the show notes. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of you at zero cost, and this is very much separate to my day job. And the way we can do that is through sponsors and partners. Let's take a moment to acknowledge them. The Contagious Code Podcast is partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters teaches the way I teach. So we use tools every day as developers like Git and Redis and Docker. What Code Crafters does is they teach you the underlying mechanism of these tools in a programming language that you know by having you re-implement them from scratch. So it's like build your own Docker, build your own Redis, build your own Git from scratch in JavaScript or Python or whatever you prefer. This way you level up your skills with the language, but also with the tool. If you'd like to give it a try, they have a generous free tier. Should you start paying, you can get 40% off using the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. The Contagious Code Podcast is also partnered with Stately. Stately is a way to visualize application logic and state as it moves through your application using their visualizer. From there, you can export your state machine or state chart to JSON and fill in the business logic that triggers state transitions. And then you've got an application that is robust and testable. They also have a framework for working with AI agents and adding guardrails and support around them. If you'd like to give that a try, go to stately.ai. Finally, that conference, Wisconsin, is happening right now, and we are partnered with that conference. It's a multidisciplinary tech conference that happens twice a year, once in Wisconsin and once in Texas. If you'd like to enter a raffle to win any that conference ticket for free, share this episode on social media and say you'd like to do so. We'll get you that ticket. Hey, thanks so much for sticking around, and now for my discussion with Glauber Costa. Glauber Costa, CEO of Turso Database. What an honor to have you on Contagious Code Podcast. Thanks for joining me.
It's my honor, man. Thank you so much for having me.
We were talking a little bit before the show. We got into some stuff about you and where you come from, and I'm so excited to dive more into all of that and the whole story of Turso and the technical details. But to begin with, for those who maybe aren't familiar with Turso or you, could you do a little bit of an introduction to yourself, what you've been up to, and maybe Turso as well?
Awesome. So as you mentioned, my name is Glauber, and I've been in this industry in general, computer science, engineering, for around 20 years. In the beginning, and it was actually my introduction, my break into the business. I was just coding for the Linux kernel as an engineer. And I did this for around 10 years. Yeah. So, and it's really just because it took an interest. So I had a lot of time, which is what I don't have today. First, because I have 3 kids. Second, because I run a company.
3 kids.
And a company. Yeah. The kids are harder.
Wow.
The kids are definitely harder. But, just it happens. And so I was in university and I just had a lot of time because that's what, the one thing, you don't have wisdom and you don't have money, but you have time. So you can transform it into them later, but that's how you start. And I really, first of all, I loved open source. I actually think I loved open source a little bit too much. And in the sense
Yeah.
that, in fact, we did not call it open source. It was free software at the time. And I was actually a member of the Free Software Foundation, which I later
Wow.
left when I met Richard Stallman in person. I said, I want no business with this individual. But and then, and then I de-radicalized a bit. But I only did open source things. I refused to even touch things that were not open source. And I had a technical interest in low-level stuff. So there it was, like Linux. And this was the year 2000. So Linux was not what it is today. It was not like the default thing that everybody uses. Was the counterculture. So it was great for like a teenager
Yeah.
like myself, like with free software.
Yeah. Stick it to the man.
And stick it to the man. There you go. Let's do it. F. Bill Gates and all those things. I mean, that part maybe didn't change that much, but although Microsoft today, I do respect. But so they were, just I started and initially just contributing code as a volunteer. Not very good code, by the way. Just I don't want to oversell myself. But then I joined Red Hat in around 2005, and then my code got a little bit better out of sheer practice. Just because I wrote a lot of it. And then I met my co-founder. So my co-founder was not at Red Hat, but he was also contributing to the Linux kernel. He was one of the maintainers in the memory management space at the time, Pekka, from Finland, as the name implies. And we've been doing stuff together since then. I mean, I joined a database company later, that was around 2014, which was not a database company at first, but it pivoted into a database company. I joined as employee number 3. Pekka joined as employee number 4. And for the audience, if you're familiar, that was Scylla, the NoSQL database. Yeah, so Scylla. This is how we broke into database. I had no interest in databases back then. It was just like, why would I? The database sound boring. Better for my profile and for my interests, it's better than front-end development, but it's still boring, right?
Yeah.
So what I really wanted to do is like keep hacking into operating system stuff, which was, by the way, this startup's initial product. The initial product for when we joined was something in the kernel space. Again, didn't work, pivoted to Scylla. So we stayed in this company for around 8 years, Pekka and I together. So we've been working together for a very, very long time. And then at some point, we founded Turso.
Interesting. There's a lot there I want to unpack. You mentioned you started contributing to open source and working in open source.
I paused exactly because of this. You said, like, tell me about you and about Turso, but I figure you might want to ask questions. So just
yeah, good. You've done this before, probably.
I've done this before, man.
About I must say, I hear the Brazilian accent come out with the like, I've done this before, man, and I love it. Okay, yeah? Side note, right? But you mentioned you started contributing to open source in university. You started working on the Linux kernel in university because you were very stick it to the man. Like, I want to contribute to this. What language was that? Was that C? Is that what the Linux kernel was written in? Okay, so you went from C.
It was a mixture of I want to stick it to the man and like I don't want to, the stuff that I like is very low level. I always like it was a lot of C and a lot of assembly as well because I worked a lot. So the Linux kernel is mostly in C. Most people who work in the Linux kernel will code exclusively in C. Now these days, I guess Rust got added to the Linux kernel as well. But in particular, I was interested in the lowest of the lowest level stuff. So I've done a bunch of assembly because there are parts of the Linux kernel that are written in assembly. And usually it's like the boot sequence, the transition, like when you transition from kernel space, from user space to kernel space, there is a lot of processor specific things that no programming language will ever compile to that because this is not general purpose code. It's just like the registers in the processor to manage the page tables, to flush the cache and stuff like that. So like this kind of like, so every time you do like a memory management is full of that because when you switch the memory space from one process to another, you have to make sure that you invalidate the page tables and then you load the new page tables. And all of that is written with a assembly core that gets exposed in C. So people in the kernel do try to write as little assembly as possible.
Wow.
right? It's not that people are trying to do this on purpose, but there are some places like when you're touching those registers that you have to do it.
Yeah.
And then again, that's the stuff that I liked, how the processor works, how how those things actually are. So initially for me was I was just fascinated, and I want to study
Yeah.
how it happens and how it works. And it was open source, and I was in love with open source. So just Linux was just natural for me.
Yeah. This is interesting because most of the founders and CEOs on the series loved open source and got into open source. People like Brandon Bayer, people like Guillermo
Yeah.
Rauch, people like Matt Billman. It starts with this love for open source, and then I want to build something, and then you get things like MooTools and Socket.io and what we'll hear about from Turso. Okay, so it's this very low level stuff that you enjoyed. I'm curious, isn't that like painful though? Because you've got to manage memory. You've got you can maybe cause explosions if you're not careful. Can you cause
Yeah.
explosions? Like working at that level.
By the way, I just lost you for a quick second, but I think I got the gist of it because and we're doing this live, so I
Yes.
guess that's part of the problem. But you're asking me if, like, when you're working such low level, if it's true that you can physically explode things, and it is.
Did you cause explosions? What was that like?
No, but I have a very good
Okay.
friend who once did. He
Oh
physically
my goodness.
destroyed network cards with a kernel bug. Yeah, I
Wow.
mean it's not, and it was very common. It was very common for people to destroy monitors as well. Yeah, like those before LCDs, like you had those
Yeah.
big monitors, like
Yeah.
tube monitors. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
they would explode, but I never worked in those things. Right?
Wow.
So the
Yeah.
the closest thing I've got to this was a modem, which I wrote a driver
Mm-hmm.
for, but it did not explode. So like
So
yeah.
yeah, okay, so that's super low level. And now you find yourself with Turso. I want to draw a line. So what we do on this podcast, by the way, is
Yeah.
draw lines. Like we have this one episode where we start with like electrons. How does that become electricity? How does that
Yeah.
power CPUs and so on? That's my favorite episode actually. So okay, let's
Oh,
draw a
nice.
line. So you've done this. With the Linux kernel, C, very low level, managing paging tables, all of this stuff. You enjoy it. You wanted to study it. And then you sort of join this company that's making kernel space stuff
Yeah.
with C and C++, so it's operating system level, and then they pivoted to make a database. I want to understand this pivot because I know ScyllaDB pretty well. It's essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's essentially Apache Cassandra compatible database, but
Yeah.
implemented in C++ instead of Java,
Yes.
where Cassandra is Java, right? So how did that happen? How does one
Well,
pivot from I'm doing kernel space stuff in C, probably C++, to
C++.
making a
Yeah.
database engine?
So first of all, the most accurate way to describe Scylla is that you've got, I think, 95%. None of it was incorrect. I think there was a 5% missing that I will add, which is it's a
Thanks.
Apache Cassandra compatible database written in C++ by a bunch of Linux kernel people. Because that is what made all the difference. The thing about Cassandra, when we looked at it, is that, and in all fairness, I was actually against the pivot because I just had no interest in databases. So,
Yeah.
but it was quite successful. So I guess it was wrong. But when you look at Apache Cassandra, which was very popular at the time, and this was again 2013, 14. But this is when I joined the company. The pivot was 2 years later. So I guess but still Cassandra was fairly used, still is in a sense. I mean, not web developers will not see it that much, but still like a quite popular database. Cassandra is so just to get everybody on the same page, Cassandra was a distributed
Thanks.
system, like a very aggressively distributed system. And we would see clusters commonly with like thousands of nodes. So it's like this database with 1,000 nodes. Like not every
But
Cassandra cluster had it.
by nodes you mean servers, just for the
Servers,
listeners who are
yeah. So it wasn't that you find the 1,000 node deployment every corner, but they existed in double digits at least. So it could scale horizontally. It would essentially scale horizontally and automatically shard it. You could add nodes, you can remove nodes, you can do all this stuff. And like the database is just always there, highly available, always available.
Yeah.
The implementation of a Cassandra node was terrible. And it wasn't terrible just because it was written in Java. It was terrible because it was written by distributed systems people. Right? So I don't think we at that company had, especially at the time, I learned a lot, true. And there were some people in the company that were super good, but like the people at the company were all, if not all, like 90% of the people were from the Linux kernel. And we were doing an operating system before.
Yeah.
And the ones who were not were either attracted to that or good friends with the Linux people. So I don't think we could have designed a distributed system as good as Cassandra, but we didn't have to because you just copied the architecture, right? It was just because it was compatible. In the same way that they could not have designed a node, like a server implementation as efficient as we did, because that's what we knew, like how to properly use the storage. And the story of that is that how that actually came to be. So how the pivot came to be. First of all, the product that we were working on after 2 years was a failure. And
what was this product? Was it an operating system?
It was called OSV. And
okay. That's so interesting.
You still find traces around it on the internet, but it's still maintained actually. Like there were a community that formed later, but didn't really see any production usage. This is how I define failure. We organized the meetup in San Francisco, and we offer, like we announced in the channels that we had, like the mailing list and etc. Hey, we're gonna be a meetup in San Francisco. Come, and then we bought a bunch of pizza. We got a space in a co-working space, and nobody came. Then we told the people in the co-working space, hey, we're hosting this meetup here about, what's this about? And then we tell them what's this about. There's free pizza. No, that's fine. So like nobody came, even though, not even the people in the co-working space, even though we were offering free pizza. So this is failure. In the sense. Like it just, it was great technically, like technologically, of course, it was great. We worked on it for 2 years, which is something you should not do, honestly. Although it's funny because a lot of the highly successful startups do that because you have a vision and this vision takes long and you do it. But it's a risky bet because then again, after 2 years, today as a founder, and I asked this to their founder now, I don't understand how they didn't run out of money because it was like a fairly expensive team for 2 years that didn't produce any results, right? And then we coded Scylla for almost another 2 years. So it was like 4 years until Scylla had any revenue. But the company kept going somehow, and today is a great success. It's just but we benchmarked Apache Cassandra a lot just because we figure it was a fairly complex application. It was a fairly popular application. So we used a lot of Cassandra to benchmark the OS and things that we were trying to find out things like, is the implementation complete, right? Or is Cassandra still crashing? Is the performance good? Is the things that, like, is the operating system able to deliver on the promises that we have, right? And some of them were performance claims. So is Cassandra getting faster by running on our operating system? And seeing Cassandra from bottoms up, we learn a lot about how terrible the implementation was. For example, Cassandra could never, ever, ever use more than 30% CPU, ever.
Wow.
And just because of locks and stuff like that, just things would wait on other things. So like people would sometimes ask me, "Oh, is it because it was IO bound?" I said, "No, it's just code bound." Right, just the way it's coded, and obviously got a lot better since then. Especially after we got into the scene, like competition does wonders, right?
Yeah,
and I guess part of the reason they were so in their defense is just they did not need to be that efficient because like they had a huge market share. Like you can always get more performance out of Cassandra by adding more nodes. Like so you add more nodes, add more nodes, add more nodes, add more nodes. So why would you invest in the performance of a single node then? Like we did. And then we got because Scylla was 10 times faster than Cassandra, sometimes a lot more. And it's things like he used the CPUs a lot better. We wrote our own async executor for C++ to write Scylla, stuff like that. So it was a very low level experience, and that's it.
Yeah. I heard many things that are like takeaways for people interested in being a founder or maybe who are existing founders that I want to sort of extract, because that's the whole point. People listen to this and they get takeaways. The big takeaway I get from this is stick with it. It sounds like these Scylla folks, the operating system didn't get traction. People rejected free pizza, right? But still, after sticking with it, after I don't know what they did to save revenue to save runway, but they did. And now Scylla, I remember reading this really great success story where Discord posted a beautiful blog post, right, about how they handle 1 trillion messages a day with Scylla. And when I told people I was going to go work for a Cassandra company, that's the first thing they said is like, "Oh, why not Scylla? Scylla's better." And I thought, wow, okay. So that's one. Stick with it, I think, is a thing. I don't know if you'd agree. Takeaway. And then the other takeaway is competition does wonders. I love that. I've worked in DevRel so many times, and usually there's a big fear with competition, and it's not seen as this is going to help us get better. Usually it's, oh, this is going to harm us with like lawsuits, and maybe it's going to somehow harm us. But
I'll be very honest. Nobody likes Peter Thiel says that, and I think is right. Nobody likes competition when you're in the competing side. People say they like it. Like I'm supposed to, as a founder, my PR team, as I mentioned, should come here and ask you to cut this part. But I'm supposed to say, I love competition, right? Because the thing is nobody does. Competition is good for the user. So when you are in the user seat, it's great.
Yeah.
When you're competing, like when you're running the company, you don't want any competition. You just want to be like and that's just the truth. Because it's risk to every time you compete, you may lose, right? And here's the thing: like people say, "Oh, your product gets better." Yes, but like you now lost control of where to invest your time, right? So in this example of Cassandra, for example, yes, Cassandra got better as a result of like Scylla.
Yeah.
But I bet that the people working on Cassandra had all of those other amazing plans in directions in which they wanted to get better at.
Yeah.
And then Scylla came into the scene, and they were forced to abandon all of that and get better single node performance, because that's the thing that we were hurting them with.
Right.
So I doubt anybody at DataStax at the time, the company behind Cassandra, was joyful because Scylla came to exist. I bet some of them said they were. None of them were.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not happy when I see competition to Turso. Not that Turso has a lot of competition in the sense that, I mean, we are late to the party in a sense of databases. So we are competition to some people, I guess. But yeah, like I see projects sometimes that and my mind automatically thinks, "Oh, this could compete with Turso." So it gets put on your fight zone of the brain. Yeah. When you are, it's just natural. It's just human instinct. Now you can learn to. There are many ways. There are many different ways in which you can act on this instinct. You don't have to be an ass about it, and you can behave as if you were welcoming competition, but in your brain, I doubt you do. I doubt you do. But when you're the user of those things, it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's fully understandable because it does trigger your threat response. And as a founder, you're responsible for people's salaries and their jobs, and you don't want to lay off anyone. But what if they threaten us so much that now we have to, And I imagine your mind just goes to all of those like worst case scenarios instantly, right?
And I think you hit the right thing, because we were talking about kids right before we started, and I said I have 3 kids, and one of the things kids do to you is that all of those fantasies about the world that you have before you have kids get shattered. Oh, I'm going to act like this, I'm going to treat my kids like that, and etc. Because at the end of the day, I have 3 useless blobs of flesh, because they don't do anything. Like they're 5 here's less useless now because it's 5, 2, and 1. If you let them be, they'll die.
Yeah.
Right? They can't feed themselves.
Yeah.
They can't clean themselves, and
Yeah.
you are responsible for their survival, and you are responsible for whether or not they will turn into good people.
Yeah.
So something happens, you feel threatened, like you feel like this
Yeah.
big responsibility. This is the most important thing in the world, and obviously that changes the way you think, the way you view things. So I think this is in a sense, becoming a founder is similar, because you have
Yeah.
all of those things in your mind about how I would behave. Oh, competition is great. I was always in the open source camp,
Yeah.
in the sense that and this, by the way, is not something that I learned as a founder. It was even something that I learned at Scylla, because at Scylla I was not a founder, but I was heavily invested. I mean, I was employee number 3. I've been to the pivot with them. I almost left during the pivot because I didn't quite believe in. I figure I'm leaving all of this OS career behind. Is this really do I really want to go code a database, etc.?
Yeah.
So I became heavily emotionally invested. So when you're emotionally invested, you love open source. But I was always thinking, yeah, maybe if we make this part here proprietary, maybe it'll be better. So you think that. Now, the trick there is that a lot of times when people think, let's make this thing proprietary, it will be better. It will not be better. So because open source was successful for a reason. So you have to learn as well to trust what you learn as being on the other side. And say, you know what, it is much better actually if this is open source, and you can even now rationalize it. So if you do it well, which I personally believe I did, you can have a more informed view of the situation and become even a better open source person. But your brain changes in a way, right? Just in.
Yeah, definitely. You become way more sensitive to things that can cause you and your family harm. As it's centuries, millennia of biological programming,
Yeah.
even, and it's good. I mean, that's why we have families that we protect. Thank you for that segue. I think there's a lot there for founders. But let's switch topics a little bit now and focus on Turso itself. You built Scylla at some point, and then you left. Did you found Turso straight away? What was the decision behind it? Okay, let's talk about that transition.
So I always wanted to start a company with Pekka, which is the person in this world I hate the most. So I figured this tension would yield something good. And Pekka might be listening. He's in Europe right now. So just
there's about 140. Actually, there's about 200 people listening at this point in time. So, and this is live. So if you want to send questions on X, formerly Twitter, send them, and I see them, and we'll ask. But okay, so you you hate Pekka. You wanted to start a company with him. What happened after Scylla?
Yeah. So I left Scylla in 2020, and if you remember, 2020 was the year you don't talk about. So I didn't really feel like starting a company. And again, I left Scylla for a variety of reasons. One of them is that I was there for a long time. So I didn't want to start a company right away because it didn't feel like the right time. This is how little I knew of the market, because it was a fantastic time to start a company. But I just did not know. So it was a lot of fear, uncertainty. I decided to move to a different city because I was living in Toronto at the time. We were under lockdown. I had this kid on this small flat, screaming,
this useless blob of flesh.
Yeah. Oh, and at that moment he was, he was 18 months. So
yeah,
it was hard. It was hard, man. So I decided to move to a smaller town where I could have more real estate with the kid. This is where I am right now. I stuck here because it's a great place. And so it didn't feel for me at the time the best risk-based time to start a company. So I'm moving, everything is up in the air, and I'm going to start a company. It didn't feel like the right thing to do. So I joined Datadog. But I love Datadog. Datadog is a great company, by the way. If anybody in the audience, because sometimes people come to ask me, hey, if I'm interviewing for Datadog, what do you think of the company? I say, man, go for it. What a great company. I really loved it in many ways. But I had later 2021, I had an opportunity to start a company. Pekka Pekka was also ready, I guess, to pull the trigger at the time. We had investment, right? Just and then we figured, hey, let's do it. And I really want to, like, financially speaking, because I've been doing like startups for a long time. I'm poor, man. That's the thing. Like, startups are this long term thing. Like, Datadog was the only. I moved from like open source hippie style kind of stuff to like some stint at RedHat. That was okay. But I was very junior, so like didn't make a lot of money. Through like 8 years of a startup that hasn't exited, so like I didn't make any money.
Wow.
Then
Yeah.
working at Datadog, I do believe, of course, they're going to exit one day, but just not yet. So
Yeah.
and I can't pay I can't buy diapers with Scylla stock. Like, nobody gets it. It's just so Datadog was the year where I made money. So I actually wanted to stay for longer. That was my plan. It's just and I wanted to start a company, but it was something like, hey, maybe in a couple of years, like in 3 years, 4 years after, like I put my life in order. But man, when you got the bug, you got the bug. When you like to build,
Yeah.
you like to build. And I had the opportunity. There was an investor that was willing to invest, and Pekka was ready. And in a sense, I felt like it's now or never, right?
Mm.
Just
But can we dive a little
so
bit into how that
yeah,
opportunity came? Were you just like minding your own business at Datadog one day, and
yeah, exactly.
suddenly an investor shows up
Yeah.
and is like, "Here's money, do something."
That's exactly what happened. And
What?
I only later learned it's more or less like that, but just it's more or less like that. But I only later learned that this is actually quite common in venture. And I think if I knew it was this common, I would have waited to start the company. So, because my plan
Mm.
was not only I would have waited, the product would, because like Scylla, this is so funny. We're gonna get existential now, because I didn't like the pivot that Scylla did. Right, I didn't like this thing about, hey, neither I did nor
Yeah.
Pekka did. Like, so we didn't like this thing about, hey, we worked on this product for 2 years. We thought at the time that the founders did very little validation, whether or not people really wanted this operating system, and let's just build. So we said, when we start a company, we're going to do everything differently. So we don't pivot.
And then you started
So,
another database company.
no, in fact, exactly. In fact, we did not. So we started a
Oh.
company, and we said we're going to do everything differently than Scylla, so we don't have to pivot, and we validate the market, and we start from the problem. We don't start from the technology, and then the product fail anyway, and we pivoted to a database company. So in a sense, like, it's it's fate is a bitch, right? I think
Yeah.
that's the lesson to unpack here. But I think part of the reason for that is that, turns out, like, so the full story is that, like, I kept being very visible at Datadog, and I released an open source project that got quite successful. Like, we got around 2,000 stars. I don't invest in it that much, but it was just a library thing, so not something for you to start a company around. And then a bunch of investors got in touch with me.
Mm.
Now that I know this business a little bit better, this is something that the lizard people do. I call them the lizard people, but it just they will see like projects getting successful. So they want to identify the potential future founders. So it doesn't even need to be like around that project, but like and just get to know you. It might
Yeah.
not even be that they wanted to start a company. It might be that, like, they want to have you in their network. So if someday somebody, because they essentially, their job is to do networking, right? And
Yeah.
help companies. So maybe one day you can be helpful to this other company in their portfolio. Like, I did not know any of that. And then I just took and we had this idea, Pekka and I, like, of what could become the company, and we were
Yeah.
thinking like about it. Like, we would meet on Saturdays sometimes and say, hey, look, just what if we did this, and that. And I actually had multiple investors reach out to me, all like they're super early seed stage. I did not know that. For me, it was all like investors, a blob. and I mistook it for validation that some of those ideas that I had in my mind were very good. Right? Because I would talk to them and say, hey, I'm having this idea, like they would ask you, have you ever considered starting a company? Say, yeah, and in fact, I had this. I wouldn't do it with this project because this is just a library. There's no company there. But Pekka and I have this idea, blah, blah, and they, oh, that sounds like a great idea. Boom, right? So I actually, this led me to believe that our initial idea was much better than it actually was. Now
just to clarify, sorry to interrupt you, but the lizard people, these are investors, right? These are are these VCs?
Vulture capitalists, yeah.
Oh my goodness, dude! You run a startup. Are you not concerned that this is gonna like reflect badly on you, and you're not gonna have like fundraising potential? And
I should be, I guess, but as I said, I don't have a PR team. I'm a very authentic person.
Oh my goodness, this is live too. There's no going back, man. The toothpaste is 200 people have heard this already.
Story of my life. But here's the thing. The best investors are actually quite aware of this fact. And this dynamic between founders and investors and etc. Like and this is why I love my lead investor, Dave Zuberman. He's probably not listening because he's in San Francisco. But like he all the time he tells me stuff like that. Like when we're discussing things, I say, Glauber, you need to understand that investors are dumb. And then he explains what he means by that and etc. So if you are an investor and you are listening, do understand that like I'd say that in good spirits. But like there is a healthy tension, I think, between founders and investors to a sense, right, Justin?
Yeah. Great. Thanks for clarifying. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut off your stream of thought there. I just wanted to call that out. Okay, so you got approached, you got this opportunity. You were led to believe your idea was way better than it was.
And one of them actually invested. One of those that got in touch with me said, "Hey, look, if you want to start a company." Now, I wanted to prepare a pitch deck, and I wanted to like this. It wasn't just something like, "Hey, here's the money," but he essentially said, "I wanted to prepare this, and that, and then like I'll invest." And I think I got a lot in love with the idea that we had. And
what was the idea? We've been talking about this idea. We know it wasn't the database. You pivoted to the database.
No, it was called ChiselStrike, which is still like our company name officially in the papers. And ChiselStrike was essentially the idea of ChiselStrike was not a database, but it used SQLite as the database. And we actually wanted to do data at the edge, but what we wanted to do was a persistent layer. So it was, the idea is that you could write TypeScript, and then we would compile we would look and had an analyzer into your TypeScript, and we would compile your TypeScript to database operations. And not just SQL stuff, but like all the authorization and etc. Like, so you could write at some point like a for loop in TypeScript that would access a class, and that class was marked as a chisel entity. If you marked a class as a chisel entity, we knew that you wanted to persist data in that class. So you could just write any code with that class, and we would compile this to a. If that could be compiled to a SQL query, you could. So still there, still in GitHub. You can take a look. We embedded Dino as a runtime. So everything that was executable by a database, we would translate to a SQL query. Everything that was not, we would just execute the code transparently. So if this for loop that you wrote was not something that could be transformed into a SQL query, we just execute it as code. If it could be transformed to a SQL query, we would. And the idea was that like, hey, look, I mean, just and then we're going to push this to the edge, because lots of people at the time, I did not know what people meant by the edge, and I guess we'll get there. But our idea of the edge was, I think, very different than the idea that we later learned that the JavaScript community had. So we figured, hey, look, I'm just we're going to use SQLite. We thought SQLite was the best vehicle to distribute this code to the edge.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just worked a little bit on SQLite replication. Then we worked a lot more on the API for this whole thing, but didn't really get any traction. And just
Yeah.
to finalize the VC stuff, I mean, it got some traction. Like when I say
Yeah.
didn't get any traction, that's especially it wasn't like it wasn't like the free pizza thing. So
Yeah.
we were not that wrong. Chisel Strike, when we stopped working on it, had around 1,000 GitHub stars, and it had a couple of production users that we knew of. So it wasn't like a complete failure. It was good in a sense. But clearly, especially looking back, because at the time you were thinking, oh, if I put more effort in this thing, will it? Because things need effort. I mean, if you look at Drizzle, for example, you look at the story of their GitHub stars for the first
Yeah.
many years. And this is the hardest thing about a startup, by the way, because you know it takes time.
Yes.
You know it takes time. So you're always like, do I give up on this or not?
Yeah.
I had reasons to believe after a year working on it that it maybe wasn't a great idea.
Mm.
But I was like, but do I keep working on this or not? Like,
Yeah.
just because I know it takes time, and we are seeing now. In a sense, I think what happened with Scylla was better because after 2 years you get no users. I don't know. Just even then you could think about I want to go further, but like for us it was like, okay, what do I do with this? Right? Just thankfully, by accident, the answer came naturally. Because what we've done is that, remember, we were working on, but I was saying, like, to finish the venture story.
Yes.
I think part of the reason investors do that is that early stage investors understand that it's not that much about the technology; it's more about the founders and the team, right?
Yes.
So this guy who said, "Hey, I put a pitch deck, and I'll, if it has this and that," he iterated with us on the pitch deck. I think it's because at the end of the day, they have this understanding that a good team will figure out something, right? If this idea doesn't work, you change a little bit. And then if he sees in you, or he or she sees in you that you have this ability to do things, which is why I think they're going after like open source people. You naturally self-select for I do things, right? Just then so they were ready to write the check, I guess, and I figure let's start the company. But I don't think in hindsight, I don't think Chisel Strike was such a great idea. We keep asking ourselves, especially Pekka, if we invested more time, if we've done this or that differently, could we have been successful? And the other day, I actually found a company doing something very close to what Chisel Strike was doing. They are successful. But the thing that they did is that they didn't go after JavaScript developers. They went after the Shopify ecosystem. So the problem set, this does two things. First of all, it narrows the offering, right? It gives you a market immediately, because we did our market was like JavaScript developers, and it also narrows what you need to do technically, because our compiler, for example, had to be capable of doing a good job in every kind of JavaScript situation anywhere. And they only need to pay attention to the kind of things that people do in the Shopify ecosystem, which is a much narrower problem. So maybe we could have found our way around that. But then fate wanted, I think, us just to become a database company, because we forked SQLite, and this is how Turso was born. We forked SQLite because we were using SQLite, so we decided to fork it because we were very unhappy with the fact that you just could not contribute code back. And this had practical implications, which is another challenge for founders, by the way. You have to move very fast and etc. But you also know that if you don't invest in things sustainable, if you happen to be successful, you're not, because something.
Yeah.
So you have to have some form of what if this gets successful, and what do we do? And so we decided to fork SQLite because we figure we're not in a good place with the current governance model of SQLite. We were having to make changes to SQLite to push our product, and if you just make those changes, there's nowhere to push those changes to. Now you're running a private fork with no intention. Then your fork starts to become unmaintainable. There's a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So we just decided, like, look, what we should do as good open source citizens is just offer people a path and offer people a chance to use SQLite in a different way. Again, and I want to clarify here that I don't actually think that the SQLite authors and maintainers are necessarily wrong to do what they do, right? And what is it that they do? They are, if you go to their website, they say, we're open source, not open contribution. You cannot contribute to SQLite. And SQLite is very trusted, but is only ever designed to run in small devices. Like, people run on servers, but the focus of SQLite is exactly this, like this embeddability as a database for embedded appliances, etc. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong in what they do. I do respect that, but it's one of the mantras of open source. Like, if you don't, the code is there. If you don't like it, you just fork it. So that's exactly what we did. We forked it, and we just offer people like a different way. Say, hey, this is gonna be once again a little bit too broad, but like we figure like this is our open source thing, open contribution. Anybody, this is our vision. This is what we want to do. And we said at the time, we are interested in data at the edge. So we want to do replication. We want to do this. We want to do that. But this community is open for contributions from anybody. And then we put this fork out. And we got like 1,500 GitHub stars in 2 weeks.
Wow.
Which is more than Chisel Strike had after a year.
Yeah.
So in a sense, that made the pivoting question easier. We were in this thing struggling. Is this the beginning? Like, is this just a thing that I need to put more effort towards? Or is this, But Leap SQL, which was the name of our fork, Turso did not exist at the time, was very, was fairly successful.
Thanks for that background. That makes so much sense. You said some stuff that I think is really worth repeating for founders, which is about investors. Investors go, they invest more in the founder than in the idea, than in the product. Yeah, right. And so I'm a early stage small check angel investor. So I've invested in a number of companies: Flight Control, OpenPipe, OpenSauce, whatever. And this is absolutely true. Like the people, not the companies I invest in, like Brandon Bayer, like Brian Douglas, like Kyle Corbett. These folks, they've got enormously good track records, and they all come from open source, more or less, and they all just care about. And so, 100%. I actually never really think of frankly, with Flight Control, it was positioned to me earlier as just like it's like the AWS console but better, and I was like, I don't know, but I know Brandon, and that's why.
Exactly.
So I fully agree, and I want to echo that. It's more about the person than the company, 100%.
And here's the thing: people sometimes think that not to cut you, but like people think that investor. I definitely thought that. So that's why I mentioned that there's this class of people called investors. But I guess people from outside of our industry will also see this class of people called developers or programmers. But once you're in, you know that there is a back-end developer, there is a front-end developer, there's people like me who are neither back-end developers or front developers, more infrastructure, but then you get game developers. And like in a sense, they're almost like completely different professions. Like like our cultures are so different. Investors are the same way. And I guess this is helpful because I truly do not know that. I still, it's just investors. But the reality is that they also segment by vertical, they segment by stages, they segment by many things. So like usually the firms that are doing late stage investment don't do early stage investment and vice versa. And the skill set, and part of the reason is also this because you develop a skill set that is very different. An early stage investor develops the skill set of identifying those founders, like those people with potential. Late stage investment is mostly like bankers. Those people know nothing about technology. It's like, here's the model, here's the growth, like etc. This is what I project. Like Series D, like nobody cares about what the technology is, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And also I just want to make it very clear that investment, especially early stage investment, is available to anybody with some extra amount of money that they maybe never want to see again. And risk. It's
Yeah,
extremely high risk, right?
yeah,
I don't know, like it's you hedge your bets, but there's a chance that 9 out of your 10 early investments, you'll just never see that cash again. Maybe even 10 out of
yeah,
10. And all you
yeah,
need, because it's so early, you've got in before the company was really worth anything, that when it's worth a
yeah,
lot, it's also high return. So it's high risk, high
yeah.
return, and at some point you'll end up 100xing your investment if you're lucky, if your
Mm,
founders are truly worthy of that belief, and then you're good. So I want to make sure, like anybody listening, there's about now 250 300 people listening live, and there will be more listening on the podcast when it's recorded. I want to make that very clear. Anybody can be an early stage investor, just as long as you've got money that you're willing to. It's really gambling ultimately, isn't it? Gambling on a founder.
It's more like poker than roulette, because or slot machines,
Yeah.
because it's not random, right?
Yes.
But it is gambling.
Yes, fantastic. Great. Let's talk about Turso. Let's deep dive. We already sort of started, where
Yeah,
Turso was, the idea for Chisel Strike as a data persistence layer. And by the way, that
yeah.
sounds really fun. I'm sad it didn't get that much traction. So you forked
Happens.
you forked SQLite.
SQLite.
By the way, about the governance model of SQLite, I will go on record and say they had like a code of conduct early,
They
which was
have,
like the
yes.
basically
No,
the
they
Bible,
still
right? It
do.
was like this Christian,
No, it's
like,
not. It's not.
you
Well, it's
should.
not the Bible. It's not. It doesn't even come from the Bible. It's like a Benedictine thing. It's a monk thing.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think
It
it's
is.
called the
It
code
is
of ethics
religious.
now.
Like,
But
yeah.
yeah, like follow the Lord your God is like number one, and I was like, oh wow, okay, I didn't know we were going there.
Now,
Um,
I also wanna be on record, because I do respect the SQLite people a lot. People sometimes, I wanna make that clear for two reasons. First, because I joke a lot, as and so I should stop, honestly, because some of them don't land and etc. But I have this thing that I do joke a lot. So just to and I run a company based on a fork of SQLite, so sometimes people just assume and misconstrue as like they just don't like SQLite, but it's the exact opposite. And we
yeah,
try to be very careful with our communication, that like we respect them a lot, etc. Like we disagree with this decision, but like we live in a world today in which disagreement sometimes is construed as hatred and etc.
yeah,
Like
totally.
so you have to be extra careful. And like that yes, I do not agree with their governance model. That does not mean I don't respect it, and that also,
Yes,
as I made it clear, that also does not mean that I don't think they're right to do so. I mean, look, it's your project, and SQLite is clearly has merit, so there's something good that comes out of it.
yeah,
But I want to be fair to them. Sometimes people think, oh, it's this religious thing. Like, I don't think that has religious connotations.
mm,
It's also every time you put something out, you lose control of how people are going to understand it, right? It's
yes.
the same
That's
thing as a
such a
joke thing.
great
But
principle. Wow.
yeah, this is a joke for them that can also be misconstrued with like, oh, you're just pushing religious stuff.
Yeah.
The joke is that, again, they don't believe they should have a code of conduct, and again, it's a fair belief. So just I'm very in that sense, like it's your project. You should do whatever you
Yeah.
want. So they don't believe they should have a code of conduct, but people kept asking, and then they said, "Oh, here's one." And
Oh,
they explained
interesting.
that in their website. So it's not that they came and say, "Hey, I want you to put this thing out." It's like I just don't believe a software project should have a code of conduct, which is
Yeah.
an opinion other people hold as well. And
Yeah.
when pressed to have one, they got a
Yeah.
code of conduct from a monastic order and just said, "There you go, here, register." So but
Wow.
what you should learn from this, that they effectively do not have a code of conduct. It's not don't. It's not that like they are. That is actually very different, because they're not trying to enforce those rules. Like
Yeah.
one of the things in there is like never get drunk on wine, right? It's not
Yep.
that they see you drunk on wine, you cannot use SQLite or anything like that, right? So it's very different. Like that they have this religious code of conduct. That's not the case. They just do not have a code of conduct, and when pressed to have one, they put this monastic order code of conduct out.
Wow, that's so cool. I
Yeah.
didn't know that. I thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Glauber, you know what's really I have so much respect and adoration for you because like on the founder CEO series, sometimes we get these founders, and this is not to disparage. I mean, obviously as a founder, you're very like into your thing, and we get some founders who come on and straight away want to talk about their thing in depth and only their thing. But so far we've talked about a lot of things that aren't Turso, and I appreciate that because there's a lot of insights about VCs and SQLite. But let's narrow focus and speak really about Turso. And let's do so. This is live, but also going to be published in a processed, probably nice, like pretty way later. Let's start with a definition. So now Turso, I will tell you what I know Turso to be, and then you can correct me because I'm probably wrong. And then let's talk about the edge and what that means to your target, so JavaScript developers, and what that meant to you, and what that means in the context of this whole Vercel announcement where they're moving away from edge terminology. And I'm glad we took the time to warm up and stuff because there were a lot of takeaways, and now there's about 300 people listening live, and there will be more in the podcast when it's out.
Awesome.
So we invite, by the way, if you're actually tuning in live, leave us a question on Twitter, X. Just reply to the live thing, and I'll get on that. So let's talk about Turso. This is what I know Turso to be. It's SQLite databases replicated to the edge, such that when queried from, I don't know, like a Vercel edge function, the latency is instant. Because ideally the edge function is invoked close to the Turso store. I get the data and it's off to the races back to my user's browser. Is that an oversimplification? What did I miss? Where's the nuance?
So, first of all, like I don't call Turso a edge database, at least not anymore. And we'll get back to that because I think this is the juicy part of the story. But like I do not call Turso an edge database, and I would say, like, although we don't correct people, because I would say it's even incorrect to say, because I don't even know what an edge database is, at least anymore. So that's why I say, like, I don't call Turso an edge database. So Turso is a database. It is a relational database, and more specifically is a SQLite-based relational database, right? So that is, and there are one good thing about databases and one bad thing about databases. One good thing about databases is that they're very horizontal. You can use it for many things. And the bad thing about databases is that they're very horizontal. You can use it for many things. So it's very hard to say like this or that. Like, so you can use Turso for almost whatever you want. I say almost because, I mean, there's still the domain of like NoSQL databases like Scylla. You wouldn't use Turso for the same things as you use Scylla for. Scylla is a database. I said that in other podcasts as well. SQLite is known to have a limited write capacity. And in the beginning, when people would come to our community and ask, hey, can I use Turso for this very write-heavy workload? And keep in mind, we were focusing on web use cases. I would say no. But because it's SQLite, this is the one thing everybody knows about SQLite. Writes suck. I wised up with time, and now I ask people, what do you mean by write heavy? And sometimes the answer is I get writes almost every second. So, like, one of the heaviest write workloads we've seen so far was like 300, 400 writes a second. So most of the web use cases are very read intensive. And even when you think about it, like there's not even web, but like the Visa network, I think they do like 40,000 writes per day or 40,000 writes per second of transactions, like for the credit card. Like Scylla, like the first benchmark that we released to in like say, hey, here we are, and like this is there's a database that is much better than Cassandra. We were doing 1 million write transactions per second per node.
Wow.
That was, and this right. So just in comparison to that, SQLite sucks for writes. SQLite can never do this, or never ever. You'll never do like 1 million. But like even you could build the Visa network like with 40,000 transactions per second using SQLite. It wouldn't be like a single node. I doubt Visa handles all the transactions in a single node anyway. But like SQLite, I can assure you that it can handle, if not every, because I just want to be careful. There's always the person and say, no, there is this one. Right? If not every, at least almost every web use case. So
Yeah. Wow.
it's a database for the web in that sense. Like, don't think, I don't want people thinking of Turso, especially people coming from the web. I can't do those things. I can't, like, whether or not SQLite is good for you, like SQLite has some advantages in the developer experience. SQLite is very simple, so there are things that you can do with other databases that you can't do with SQLite, and there are things that SQLite is very good at. But this is mostly up to you, not up to the use case. SQLite can handle every use case in the web. So I do want people to think of Turso as a database, right? No. There are a couple of things that we do very well. And the first thing that we did very well, and today is not the only thing that we do very well. There are two things that, there are many, but there are two things I believe are our guiding, like the things that people come to Turso for the most.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is data replication, right? We can talk about the other one later, but data replication. So first of all, keep in mind the story of how Turso came to be. So we were working on this thing about like replicated data from TypeScript. So we were interested in this problem, and we worked on, Scylla was also like a distributed database before. So we were interested in this problem, and we forked SQLite, and immediately what we wanted to add to SQLite was a native way to replicate data. And our thesis was the following. Look, people are more and more, like, and this is not only JavaScript people, but we identified that this was being seen a lot in the JavaScript community, more and more deploying to the edge. Our idea of what the edge is, and I still think we're right, because I mean, this is pretty much the definition on Wikipedia and other places, is that the edge is a fuzzy concept first and foremost.
Yeah.
And it's really just like something closer to you than the cloud. So the only thing that matters, like the problem there is like to be a database for the edge, to be a database that edge people are going to adopt, we need to be really good at data replication. Again, this was already a problem we had in mind. This was already something, and we knew that SQLite being so small and efficient, one of the problems with the data replication is nothing new. Data replication, exists since the 70s. The problem is that it's very expensive to keep replicas. So to keep many replicas, it's fairly expensive. So we wanted to make replication cheap and easy. So what the couple of things we've done. So first of all, Turso is very cheap to do replication. Our $29 a month plan costs $29, of course. The $29 plan costs $29 and comes with 6 locations. So for $29, you can already replicate to 6 locations. And we actually, and you can add more. So just it's fairly cost efficient. And you have a single URL. And we have this since the beginning. We've been doing this for a year. PlanetScale just announced this recently. And I think it's part of the competition thing. I don't think they would have done it if Turso wasn't on the space. But
yeah,
you have a single URL, and we route the request to the right replica. So when you execute, if you are using like a traditional database, not only is it fairly expensive to maintain all of those replicas, you have to be thinking about, which replica am I accessing now? And this becomes a configuration nightmare. Like Turso's not like that. Turso has a single URL. You connect to the URL. It routes you to the closest replica. And then the next question is data consistency. So we also work to make sure that you have regional rights consistency. And what that means is that in a single object, if you write a value and you read after that, you're going to read the value you wrote. And again, this is not that easy to do because in a lot of replicated systems with passive replicas, what happens is that you write the value there's replication lag, so you haven't hit your
Yes.
replica yet. Now you read from the replica and you read something. So you wrote a value and now you read a so. And for the more distributed system oriented folks in the audience, that does not mean strong consistency, because other clients will still see the older values, but it's exactly like read your writes in a single client, in a single function. Everything you read, you write, you read your writes, right? So we have, so we built a system like that initially. Like you replicate it, you cheaply replicate it, you easily replicate it, and you have the single URL that gives you access to all the replicas. So that's what Turso essentially was very, very good at. And then we figure, like, let's people in the Edge community need this database. Let's try selling it to them. And this is how we learn that the Edge was becoming a little bit of a cursed word in a sense, and this was very puzzling to us. And
is it because there was a conflation between the edge as it is formally defined, which is a network edge is the closest point between you and the internet? That's the formal and accurate, I agree with you, definition. And it was being conflated with really edge compute. So running code in V8 isolates or some type of lightweight JavaScript runtime at the edge. But the confusion was the edge was construed as a runtime as opposed to just a network node.
Well, but even then, it's not even conflating. I was going to correct you, but then later you said like the runtime thing, I think, is the core of the issue. But you can have edge compute, and that's not the issue. The issue is not that the edge was conflated with edge compute. I'll give you an example. Fly.io does edge compute, which is what we use to build our offering, right? So, and Fly.io does not have those issues with V8 and etc. because they give you containers at the edge, right? And you deploy at the edge. And a lot of these functionalities that we have of like a single routing, like we rely on Fly.io features a lot to offer that. So you can do, like Fly.io is super interesting because we don't necessarily use that because we run persistent systems, but they automatically scale to one your VMs in the closest region where the request came from. So like this is edge compute to me, right? So you can have a bunch of VMs, the VM scale to 0, and if they're not persistent, like for Turso it takes a little bit longer because you have the volumes, you have the data, etc. But like people just running like containers, non-persistent containers, like the application comes up, does the stuff, scales to 0. Then scales to 1 closer to the request when the request comes from. So this is edge compute. There's nothing wrong with that. So saying that Turso would be a great database for edge compute is not incorrect. But what happened, like, and this is an example that we give, like one of the things that was very puzzling to us. So in the beginning, I say like I don't like saying that we're edge database. We're not an edge database. But in the beginning, we didn't shy away from saying that we were a good database for the edge. And our messaging talked about the edge a lot, right? So this is just technicality. And we even, we would have said at the time we are an edge database because we wanted to have this focus. Like, we also knew like people would come because it's SQLite. And we had those internal debates. What do we put front and center? So we knew what we were. We were like a SQLite database that worked very well in those scenarios. But what do you put front and center in your messaging? And we actually did some back and forth experiments. Do we put SQLite front and center, or do we put the edge front and center? And they both kind of worked reasonably well. But 70% of the people that created databases on Turso, we were like, so we put the service out. We started with a private beta, and then we moved to a public beta, and then we essentially put it out there. Like after a couple of months, we looked at the data that we had, and Turso really exploded. Right, so it's just we have we've been growing like 30% almost every month in number of users, etc. Like the curve is fantastic. So even early on, after a couple of months, we had like a decent sample size of people using Turso and getting interested. And because of the messaging, most of them were using the edge. but 70% of them do not use replicas. So there are only 30% of the people created replicas. And we found, like, we look at other modern databases like PlanetScale, etc., and they were also at the time using this messaging of like edge database for the edge and edge database, and not that they were also saying that they were an edge database, but they used heavily this messaging of edge. And PlanetScale had read replicas, but not the single URL that we have today. Like I guess this is on the video. Not read replicate, not just today they do like the networking routing. Read replicas were fairly expensive. Nobody was using them. And we were like, how come they can call themselves like an edge database? What does that mean? And we were talking to some prospects like, hey, I mean, this is I'm Glauber, just trying to gain business. I will run a database company, want to talk further. Becoming the LinkedIn monster I always despised, I guess. See, other side of the aisle. And some people would say, oh, it's interesting. I love SQLite, but I don't use the edge. Oh, what do you use? I use Node.js. Right? And for a while, this bugged my brain. I was like, what are those people talking about? Like that, what's that? And as we unearthed this, and that's the moment where like we kind of abandon, like our site still has a lot of mentions to the edge, and they will be there because like this is still important. But we kind of abandoned like the edge front and center because of this. We understood that this community that was very important to us, through no fault of their own, I think, mostly because of messaging, and a lot of that messaging was from Vercel. Just I don't think they're exclusively the issue, but like that's a big issue.
Yeah, I mean, there has to have been some also from Cloudflare, for example, with workers and D1 is basically a competitor, right? At this point to Turso. I mean, we don't have to go down that hole, but
But I think but I think Vercel did a little bit worse because Cloudflare. So the whole story. And now you correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a web person. Like there's Node.js.
Yes.
And I already understand that Node.js is this thing that everybody loves to hate, but also everybody uses.
Yes.
Right? Node.js has a couple of issues in terms of like code starts and like the APIs from the web are completely different from the APIs on the servers. I don't know how you guys live in this mess, to be honest. Like, and I feel comfortable saying that I shouldn't. This is me joking again, but like the JavaScript community seems to be very self-aware of the mess that JavaScript is. So just hopefully nobody takes offense on that.
Yeah.
But then there's this other runtime. That was a runtime that was designed to be a good runtime to use from the edge.
Yes.
Because it had a couple of properties. And there's another thing on the mix in here. The edge from Vercel Cloudflare is also serverless. Like the edge doesn't have to be serverless. And this got into the mix as well. Like the edge is a runtime to execute functions. And I just gave you the example of flight.io that executes containers. So it doesn't have to be functions. But the particular edge that was being pushed for was serverless, functions, V8 based, and it was a different runtime that was completely incompatible with Node.js. And the problem for me, and look, I say that, and I understand Lee, when he was talking about this, he did the mea culpa and the admission that, we kind of did wrong with messaging. So again, I'm not accusing Vercel of anything. They seem to be aware that they made a mistake, but I think it's a mistake that needs to be said. They decided to call this thing Edge Runtime.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where the problem started to come from, because I would hear things like, I don't like to use the Edge because then I don't have this and this and this and this from Node, right? Just it became this thing about, do you prefer Node.js or do you prefer Edge?
Yeah.
And I don't use Vercel. We use it internally at the company, but like apparently the way you choose is that you do runtime equals Edge. So you're choosing like Edge. Edge is that.
That is true. Yeah, I've done that.
Guillermo, when he was announcing like we're moving away from the Edge, he said Node. He said in his tweet, and we're moving back to Node.js, right? So I think it got conflated, and at some point people were going back to PlanetScale. Why was PlanetScale calling themselves an Edge database, even though they were not investing in read replication? Because they were accessible over HTTP. And you could not, one of the many problems that this runtime had, many advantages as well, but one of the many problems apparently that this runtime had is that you couldn't really connect to databases. It had issues with connection pooling, and it was hard to open TCP connections from. So a database had to have a HTTP proxy in front of it. So once you have this HTTP proxy, you can call yourself an Edge database. Now, Turso also had, it's not that Turso had an HTTP proxy, it's that Turso was and is HTTP native. That is actually the only way to connect to Turso from the internet, but we did it for a variety of reasons, not just because we were not even aware of this issue, as you know, when we started. But, we focused just a lot on the replication parts, and it's really only a slice of this community that was going to the Edge that was really looking for replication, as our numbers shown. Like the 30% of the people who were deploying, they really were happy, and replication. The other people, again, this is the thing. This was super puzzling. The 70%, 30% split for me was incredibly puzzling, man. I spent weeks trying to unearth and understand it because I understood the people that did not want to use Turso because they didn't care about the Edge.
Yeah.
I did not understand people that used Turso and didn't create a replica because they wanted the Edge, and the Edge in my mind was you could not dissociate it from replication. And then talking to those people is when I understand, okay, so you are using the Edge. Oh yes, I love the Edge. I do everything on the Edge. And you don't create replicas. No. Why do you use Turso? Oh, because it's I like SQLite and it's over HTTP. So what? It's over HTTP because the Edge only does HTTP. I said, what are you talking about? But then that's how I started to understand this process. And so look, it is what it is. We're small, Vercel is big, and then we decided just not to call ourselves an Edge database anymore.
Yeah.
Not to even say that we are exclusively use this as the main messaging. Like we're still very efficient with replicas. You can create as many replicas as you want. Essentially, like we can offer up to 30 today, more in the future. 6 already for $29. Lots of people are using that. All good. But we found like we lean a lot more today on SQLite and the broader use case because I think that the Edge terminology got a little bit tainted.
Yeah. This whole thing you mentioned about setting a config for runtime as Edge or Node.js in Vercel, man, I've done that. I've literally set that, and to me, I've always known what the Edge is, and I've always known that when they say Edge in the context, it means runtime. But I can fully understand how people who don't have that knowledge would mistake. Well, that's wild, and to hear the implication it had on your entire business. Wow. Well, kudos to you for like actually talking to people and finding out what do you mean you love the Edge, you don't use replicas. This doesn't. I feel like this is actually a really good case for DevRel. Ideally, if there's a DevRel team or something, they would also have those conversations and figure it out. Wild. Okay, so you've moved now from calling yourself an Edge database to a globally replicated database. Is that close? What's the messaging now? How has it changed? And let's maybe start there. And I have another question.
The messaging, if you go to our website right now, is just SQLite for production. That's it.
Okay.
And what we mean by SQLite for production is, again, SQLite is this amazing database that everybody likes. Again, not everybody. Maybe there's a SQLite hater on the crowd.
Yeah,
Hello.
we'll ban
I
them.
still love you back. But SQLite is very respected. But it's when we say SQLite for production, we don't mean that SQLite is not stable enough to be run in production.
Yeah.
It's obviously the complete opposite. SQLite is one of the most stable pieces of software there is. But to run SQLite in production for web use cases, you have to set up your own backups and you have to set up this whole thing. And like it's just a file, and then you now how do you move this file to another server? And then the server die. Like how do I scale this horizontally because now this file is in a single machine, and so running SQLite in production, especially for web use cases, is not easy, and you have to
Yeah.
build machinery around it to do. So that is exactly the machinery that we build. You can access your SQLite files locally because we replicate. We replicate very well. So globally, we can replicate the SQLite file inside your own server, and then you do local reads with zero latency, zero network latency. By the way, people sometimes keep saying, "Yeah, but you still have the latency of the operation." Of course, but you don't have the network latency because we replicated this inside your server. Mind you, that actually does not work from the edge, right? The Vercel edge, because you don't have a file system I can replicate you, but it works on Fly.io very well, for example, right? So yet another case for us to like stop saying edge. And this is edgier than the edge because I'm really like wherever you are, like we can replicate inside your own cloud or inside the AWS on-prem, however, wherever you want.
Wow.
We can put a replica. We have our own infrastructure, and then if you are using serverless from Vercel, Cloudflare, etc., you put the database as close as possible, and then you connect to that with some latency, but still low latency. But if you have a file system available, I replicate the database inside your server if you so desire, and then you pay zero latency, right? So we do that. We also, like another thing, when I said there are two things that people flock to Turso to, the other thing is that in SQLite it's very easy to create databases. Creating a database in SQLite takes 500 milliseconds because it's just creating a file. Creating a database in SQLite takes nothing. Creating a database on Turso takes 500 milliseconds because we have some bookkeeping to do. So, but that's it. And we can spend millions of them. So lots of people have been coming to Turso recently without replication. And now I know why. But what they want is they want to create a database per user. They want to create a database per tenant. They want to create a database per session. Like there are many people in the Turso platform that create many databases in the hundreds, in the thousands, maybe even we don't have anything in the millions yet, but like hopefully soon. But this is the other use case that, and again, people have been doing this with SQLite for time immemorial. We just make this easier possible. And we also do replication. So replication is at the core of what we do. But there are many people that come to Turso, and now I understand it even more because now we have features like multi-database creation. There is a feature in beta now that you can change the schema of one of those databases, and the schema change reflects to all of the databases that you have in the database group. Things like that. So things like if you could, people were doing, as I said, and this story is fun because in the beginning, we could not create architecturally, and our focus was just replication. So let's figure that out. It wasn't that easy to create many databases on Turso. You could create 6, which is already more than a lot of people, a lot of services. You could create 6 databases on the $29 plan, 3 for free. So we had this idea of like creating a database is relatively cheap to other providers, but it was a little bit cheaper, not. But people in the community kept asking, hey, one of the things I love about SQLite is that I can create a database per user. Why can't you give me this? And then we talked to those users. This is key in running startups. We talked to those users, we understood the use case, and we figured, okay, those are the architectural changes that we need to do to make that happen. Let's make that happen. Right? So you can... Replication is at the very core of what we do, but there are many other things today that people find enticing about Turso.
Awesome. I'm curious, since replication is at the core of Turso, I'm so surprised to hear that the headline on the website now is it's SQLite for production, as opposed to globally replicated SQLite for production. Is it globally replicated? I guess not. You have to choose your replicas and where you want them.
Well, again, the reason I don't like globally replicated, because it doesn't talk to this use case of like it can replicate inside your own server or inside the device, or have a car, it can replicate in the car, or stuff like that. So just maybe massive replicated will be better, and etc.
Yeah.
But as I said, like replication is at the core of the Turso technology. But a lot of the people that messaging is the hardest part of any startup. Okay?
Yeah.
The reality is that a lot of the people that come to Turso still do not replicate. So when you say globally replicated or replicated SQLite for production, the people who don't want replication think that Turso is not for them.
Yeah.
So again, and we learned this by talking and seeing and testing those messages. Many people say, "Oh, I'm not interested in data replication." So so we went for a messaging that is broader and less exclusive, and just say, "Hey, this is SQLite for production." Now you will talk. There is replication there throughout the website, but that's not in the headline. Because we don't want you to feel excluded if you don't want to replicate your databases, which a lot of people do. The ratio hasn't changed that much, by the way. It's around 30, a little bit more today actually, but 30 to 40% of the databases on Turso are replicated. And when they are replicated, they are massively replicated. The people tend to there's not a lot in the middle. It's like a bimodal distribution. There are people who don't create replicas, and there are people who create 6 replicas. And then a little bit more in the middle, right? But just you have those 2 modes in there. But 60% in terms of numbers alone, the numbers are not the only thing that matters, because like the use cases that replicate are more interesting for us, because we do this better than other databases, and so I don't want to downplay it and say that it's not important, etc. Like in terms of numbers alone, the majority of databases on Turso are not replicated.
Wow. Okay. I love that. We actually have an episode. It's not yet published with, it will be published probably at some point with, what's his name? With Brandon Bayer, founder, CEO of Flight Control. And he has exactly the same sentiments. He's like, messaging is the hardest thing, which is so interesting because you're building these highly sophisticated engineering products. Like, look, replicating Turso and making it reliable as a database must be super hard, but you're like, no, messaging though.
Much harder.
And Brandon. Yeah. Brandon says the same thing. Flight Control is also experimenting this way, and he gave us on the podcast a really great takeaway, which is he's like, look, you've got to measure everything, and really the indicator of your messaging is the conversion on your website. If people aren't registering at the very least, then something's not right. You need to keep changing it rapidly to see that update, and that's what you're doing. So I'm glad that there's some consensus and quorum here. For the core feature
the engineering part is the easy part of any tech startup, man.
Yeah, that's.
Or not any. I guess there are some key areas like in there. Like I guess the OpenAI, the engineering is harder than the messaging, but even then, like the transformer architecture has been around for a while. GPT has been around for a while, and like the big breakthrough came from when OpenAI put this in chat form.
Yes,
right?
It was a UI. It was a front end innovation that really led to it taking off, wasn't
it? Exactly. So you would have asked all those like deep AI researchers, what is the thing that matters the most? They would not have said that. They think it's like this the architecture, and it's not. Like it's the positioning, it's the messaging.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're figuring it out, and it seems to be working at this point. So I hope it gets better. Coming back to Turso, the benefits of this replication, I think it's worth for the listeners outlining. So again, I'll say what I think are the benefits, and you can correct me where I'm wrong. When I was working at Spotify, actually, this would have been super useful because we wanted a database that was highly redundant and also highly available. And this is probably the biggest benefit of such replication, right? You replicate the data across a variety of geographies. So one, it's also more performant, meaning if somebody
Yeah.
from Germany accesses it and you replicate in Europe, then it's going to be faster. So there's the performance, but there's also the failover, meaning if something is down, just read from a replica or write to a replica, and the data. So it's high availability and performance. These are the two like salient benefits of this replication. Are there more?
No,
Did I miss some?
you don't in the Turso architecture, and
Yeah.
we keep the architecture very simple. There are a variety. The other thing that I think people need to learn more is that people, especially once you learn, is almost a consequence of learning. In my case, through experience, I guess the messaging and
Through
position
pain.
is the hardest thing, because a lot of tech founders and tech people tend to think that you need to be solving like the hardest possible problem, and that's the thing that but once you learn that this is not the most important thing, you free yourself to seek simpler solutions. So I mean, Turso replication is relatively simple. And one of the things that we don't do from what you describe is just multi-master replication. So if your primary were to go down, you cannot write to the Turso database. You can still read from the Turso database.
From replicas.
From replicas. But you can no longer write, because think about it. Writing, and this was the bread and butter of Scylla. So like for the use case that you describe on Spotify, if you really needed like this thing that you can always write to and read from, and it doesn't, like you can have a nuclear war and the database is still available, then you're looking
Scylla. Go for Scylla.
Yeah. But what happens is that you write to a node, and then again, we usually call it nodes in distributed system, right? So you write to a node, and somebody else write to another node, and you have a network partition in the middle. They probably potentially wrote conflicting things. So the database has to essentially resolve this conflict when they come back online. And it can be down for hours. Like network partition sometimes can take hours. It's really hard to do this with SQL, because SQL has all the consistency properties that's why most of the good, highly available databases are NoSQL, like in case of Cassandra and Scylla, right? Because you don't, the data model pushes the consistency to you, the user. So what's the drawback? It's hell now to reason about the system, because you can be reading, like you can always be reading values that are older and you never really know what you're reading from. Like the database is available, but it's not consistent, right? It's the famous cap theorem. You cannot do both. Now, Turso is not like that. Turso, again, imagine writing something like that to resolve conflicts in SQLite or SQL in general is very hard. So it has a single primary. If that primary is unavailable, you can no longer write to the database. Now, we are working on something that if you replicate, you could. We are writing on something that would allow you to do this, but then you have a lot of guarantees that needs to be. We would essentially discard the writes from one of the. What we're thinking about is something in which you register a callback, and then this callback is going to be called if this data needs to be invalidated. So you write to the database, and maybe this data, after you believe it's committed, maybe you can still get this callback called and say, hey, this thing that you thought was committed was actually now reverted because some other node online, and we decided to use their version of things. But see how this is already much more. We never want this to be the main way in which this will be like an advanced feature that some people using Turso would use. So always available for reads, not necessarily available for writes.
Yeah, and just I love that you put it so eloquently. The reason is because of SQLite being a relational database, and so you can have a write, for example, on something where its corresponding foreign key was deleted just before.
Exactly.
And then you have a whole consistency issue, right? That's fantastic. Thank you for making that distinction. We're almost out of time. I can't believe it, man. We have so much more to discuss, which maybe we should do a part 2. But anyway, I wanted to ask you. This is probably the final question. I wanted to ask you about the fastest way. I mean, you're not a web person, you mentioned, but I'm curious if you could speak to this, because the big problem now for web developers and making performant web pages is the round trip between a client reading a website, going to a data center, and getting the data, basically. And if your data center is in US East and your person is in Australia, this is going to take longer. And so what Vercel did with their Edge runtime was, we're going to make this faster by when you query a website, you get basically a static shell from the edge with no data, no user data, because that lives in a database. And then if you require user data, your thing executing in the edge runtime makes a query to US East and gets back the data and then sends that to the user. The problem is you're going to US East. With Turso, can I solve this problem by just putting a replica near ocean? If my analytics are saying there's a bunch of people in Australia, I just create a new replica, put it there, solved. It's faster.
Yes, pretty much. Now, I'm not competent enough to talk to this whole approach that Vercel is pushing about dividing static from dynamic, because look, from my
of course
engineering point of view, like just thinking about a conceptual engineer without any front-end experience, the impression that I have is that the final time is the same, right? Because the operation is not ready until all the. However, I do understand that like human interactions are different. Like the reason I'm not a front-end engineer is that I just don't like people, and I don't understand people, right? So I'm a systems programmer. So like for me, it's just like this. Okay, but the time to complete the operation is the same.
Yeah.
But intuitively, I do understand that when you are on a website, like if something happens faster, this gives you an impression of being faster versus stalls for a long time. So I mean, I can see that. So I think there's obviously something there. What I can competently talk to is like if despite doing this, you want to have so I wanted the data part to load faster. And just that's exactly the problem that Turso solves. Look,
fantastic.
The whole edge conversation, people kept saying, there are two problems with the edge. Like, first of all, I prefer Node.js. Node.js is faster. And like, look, learn on that. And also your data is on US East 1 anyway. So this is the part that Turso solves. So like that solved with Turso, right?
Yeah.
He said something interesting, which is, it's faster to do the way we're doing now because you have fewer code boots anyway. Because, right, just when you're doing, but this is also, again, a factor of the edge runtime. I mean, the code boots are not a property of the edge. It's a property of this
of the runtime.
Of the runtime. That just but be it as it may, like if you want to, if you do have enough volume in a place and you decide I want data to load faster from this place, Turso is absolutely the solution for you. And look, I want to clarify once more in case it wasn't clear, because we have to over clarify everything. Still, there are still a lot of people who use the edge in the right way, which is like I'm going to this because of the geographical thing. I mean, a lot of those people are our customers. They are on Turso. We just call it replication, right? So it's not that we gave up on the idea. Like it's just that we stopped using the word edge because it's a word that became very loaded. But this is still something. If in your train of thought you ever think, I wish I had data closer to this place, I mean, Turso is the best database for you. So we still do this very well. It's still one of the leading things that take us people to Turso. As I said, we actually replicate better than that, because if you happen to have a server, you replicate inside that server. We just don't use the word.
Right. Fantastic. I lied. I said that was the last thing, but then I just remembered one thing I have to ask you, and then we'll wrap up. One thing I absolutely have to ask you. I've been asking this of every guest in the founder and CEO series, and the reason I'm doing this is because I talk to them, and everyone's experience is so vastly different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm trying to glean from this is like a standardized, reproducible list of things for founders and CEOs to pay attention to. Like HTML, for example, JavaScript,
Mm-hmm.
is a living standard. It's a specified, standardized programming language. And I wonder if we can, through everyone's unique experience, extrapolate like abstract things that are reproducible. So create some type of like living standard for what to expect as a founder CEO, especially a technical founder CEO. If there was such a document like the technical founder CEO charter, what should you know? What should you be aware of? We already talked about messaging being a really hard problem.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe first time founders don't get that. I'm curious if you could contribute to such a document from all of your experience as a founder CEO in the tech space, what would you add?
Oh God, I that's hard because I don't know what's already in the document, right? There's
Well, no,
so much.
let's assume
Yeah,
nothing,
it's
because
nothing.
if it's repeated, it's even better.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I see. So you ask hard questions, man. Because like, what is the most important thing for a
It doesn't have
founder
to be
to
the
learn?
most. It could
Yeah.
just be something salient. It keeps coming up. You
Yeah.
didn't expect it. Like the thing about VCs, right? For example, they
Yeah.
they make you believe your idea is better than it could be something along those lines.
Well,
Whatever.
this is not the VC's fault. I want to make it
Yeah.
incredibly, entirely. This is the founder's fault, and it was my fault, right? So it's easy as a founder. Understanding which signals you should be paying attention to is very hard.
Yeah.
Because of this, like you have everything that validates, in a sense, the idea that you have. You never know. I mean, being a founder is essentially like trying to find the path in the dark for something. So you don't
Yeah.
know where you're going. You think you know where you're going, but you don't really. So all you have is a small flashlight. So everything that you see that shows you a path, you think, oh, that's great, but you can't see the whole path. Only as you
Yeah.
walk, you can see the path. The other thing that I would say, so that's definitely one. We'll have three with them. So we talked about the messaging being the hardest part. It is the hardest part, messaging and positioning. There's this thing about be very careful with validation, because it's not just about VCs. Sometimes you take validation from the wrong type of user. You take validation
Yeah.
from the way meetings end up going, and like you take validation from people saying your idea is good. You take validation from people saying, like I heard about Chisel Strike in the beginning, like this user that we asked, he said, this tool is this before we started the company. This is fantastic. This can solve like so many problems for me. And then he said the problems that he could solve. Once, of course, we reached out to him once the product was in beta, and he had no interest in using. Right. So learning, it's very important to learn what validation means. That was the mistake that we had with Scylla. Like Pekka and I had this idea of we thought, at least from our perspective, maybe the founders at the time did a lot of validation, we just did not see. But we thought that they didn't really validate the idea of the operating system, and we're going to do it differently. We're going to validate it extensively. We did something worse. We validated incorrectly. And this gives us the impression that this is such a brilliant idea because all users love it, but very few people wanted to use it. So validation, learn to validate is important. I think the third one, and I said that in another podcast the other day, it's so important to move fast.
Yeah.
And however fast you think you could move, you can probably move a little bit faster. And especially in the very early days. People have very outsized expectations of what their companies will become and how fast their companies will become. We've done that, and I think this is why we learn it so deeply. We've done that in Chisel Strike. Like you think about this beautiful architecture that can handle that many users, but then the users never come, and then you wasted all this time for nothing. And even at Turso, Like we are doing, as I said, we're doing super well, and we're growing 30% month over month in number of users, databases, and etc. As
Wow.
I said, but in the initial months of Turso, even though the rate was good, the raw numbers were very small, right? So
Mm,
you can all even in a database company, like it doesn't matter really what you're doing. It truly matter. This beautiful architecture that you have in your head really isn't needed. There's so many things that as database people, I mean, as people who develop a database for 8 years, we thought that we needed in the
yeah.
infrastructure. And we're only building some of those things now after
Wow.
all this time, and they really just were not needed. Just, truly were not needed. You just and we discussed it and we figure like, hey, this is what we need to do, and then we decided, how about we don't do it, and that allowed us to move
Yeah.
faster. That allows us to put the product out, and turns out we did not need it. We're needing it
Wow.
now, so now we're building. But
Fantastic. I sense there's congruence there between what you said and what Matt Bielman, the founder,
oh
co-founder,
yeah,
and CEO of Netlify, he exactly same experience with validation and learning to curate validation. So I love that we're starting to really identify some core tenets of being a founder and CEO. With that, listen, Glauber, I know it's a long chat. I did ask some difficult questions, but you covered so much. I mean, from working on the Linux kernel to Scylla to Chisel Strike and the details of Edge and how it affected Turso and how the terminology can be confusing and how there are hard problems in computer science like naming things like Edge, but also how really marketing and positioning is harder. So with all of that, on behalf of myself, all the listeners, the 400 listening live, but also the many that will see the episode later and listen to it, thank you, thank you, thank you for coming on the show.
absolutely, absolutely, my pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Glauber Costa. I hope you found it as insightful as I did. I hope you fully appreciate the complexities of building relational databases in a horizontally scaled manner, and I hope the clarification around the term edge has become abundantly clear. Thank you for being a part of this podcast. It's really a labor of love, and I want to support you. If you like this content, if you're learning from and or enjoying this content, and if you'd like to support it, then if you're watching on YouTube, liking this video and subscribing to the channel is huge. If you're listening on Apple and or Spotify, if you leave up to a 5-star review, it's a great way to make the podcast more discoverable and to support it at no cost while helping people also benefit from this information. Finally, if you want to share it on your social media channels, that would also be helpful. Hey, thank you so much for sticking around. Thank you for being a part of this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in web engineering.